So first, I just want to open the floor to any questions you had from watching the review video of, what was this? Forums. Sorry, it's been a long day. And it sounds like there is one. Okay, nodding. Yeah.
So when Joe is using it as text editor and he's like WebStorm or something, he has
Yeah.
this odd little sort of running going on, which seems to really help him prevent typos. It seems to be matching words. They could be not only typing them, but after he's moved on a couple lines, it will then like be highlighting similar words. And I'm like, okay, like this is very helpful to prevent typos. What is this? I want this.
Yeah, it's WebStorm.
Can you repeat the question? It says ambient.
Oh yeah, so the question was like, what is up with Joe's editor? It seems to be helping him a lot. He uses WebStorm. I don't actually know a ton about WebStorm. A lot of people like it. A lot of people also like Visual Studio Code, which has different but similarly helpful things. Yeah. Yeah, like definitely ask Joe about WebStorm. I can tell you about Visual Studio Code and Emacs. Other people can tell you about Vim. Some people can tell you about Sublime Text. I think it is, we actually just had a discussion about this, that we want to like sort of officially recommend a more helpful editor than Sublime Text. So we seem to be sort of settling on Visual Studio Code. Joe is probably not going to leave WebStorm, and that's fine. Actually forcing people to use a particular editor is like how holy wars happen. So we're not going to do that, but I would recommend getting a editor that has autocompletion and sort of more intelligent syntax highlighting, because especially in Redux or React land, it starts to get very helpful. Other questions from the video?
Very good review video.
Excellent. Okay, great. So let's move on. This afternoon and tomorrow, you are going to be working with Redux. Redux is it's not a very big library. We can actually like go look at the Redux source code right now. And it mostly provides a way of doing things. And the promises it makes are, sorry, not JavaScript promises. The normal human promises it makes to you are, if you design your app according to like the various laws of Redux, then you will, one, always have a single state for your entire app. So that's what Redux gives you, is it gives you a store, which is the state container for all of the components in your app, or for some of the components in your app if some of them are not on Redux yet. For now, we're not going to have like sort of a weird mixed situation. For the moment, if some of your components are in Redux, we're going to like bring the rest into using Redux. And the architecture it provides is relatively simple. So let's look. I'm a little bit torn. I want to just look at using it, and then I want to look at the source code as well, but I think the source code will be more helpful after we've used it. So we're just going to walk through a little example where I have a component which is right now stateful, and we're going to make it store its state, instead of internally within the React component, we're going to have it use Redux. And so we're going to see the different parts of the Redux ecosystem. So here's my component. Here, I'll start from the top. Here's my app. Here's what it does. It shows you dumb skeleton jokes. And when you click on the question, it shows you the answer. And when you click on it again, it goes and flips to the next dumb skeleton joke. Okay. Here's how this works, and I'm not saying this is great architecture right now, but this is how it works right now. We have a stateful component called bones jokes, and when it mounts, it calls next joke. Next joke sets its internal state to be joke, which is a random joke, and answered is false. We also have this answer method that's going to set answer to true. And then in our render method, we basically check if answered is true, and if it is, we show the answer. And if answered is true, then the thing we do when we get clicked on is get the next joke. Otherwise, we set answer to true when we click on it. So it's not very complicated, but it has like a couple of, it has a couple of different states it can be in. So part of the reason I picked this as an example is because it's like pretty like ready to be in Redux. Because what Redux gives us is it gives us a model for thinking about data flow in our application that consists of three parts. Part one is the store. And the store is something that you can, oh God. So, sorry? Oh yeah, monitor Sam, please, yeah. So a Redux store holds state and is something that you can subscribe to. And it has a dispatch method that takes an action and causes some state change to occur. There is also, so when you initialize the store, you have to initialize it with a reducer, which describes how the state changes when you give it an action. So it's called a reducer because it actually has the same signature as something you would pass into the array.reduce method. So the reducer is, so the store is like a state container. The reducer describes how how an action changes the state. And the signature for your reducer is going to be it's going to take the current state and it's going to take an action. And it's going to return a new state. So we've seen this before, right? Like I've kind of been alluding to this throughout the last like several weeks here, where we have this model of a stateful container, where the container is like always holding onto a state, and the state itself is immutable. So all states and all actions in Redux never change. Like the state represents a time slice of your application at a moment in time. That was redundant. You know what I'm getting at. And it can never change. The way that your application changes state is that you dispatch an action, your reducer gets that action, and it returns what the next state should be. And then the magic of Redux, which you can kind of think about how you might implement this. It's not really magic. But like when dispatch is called, it goes and calls your reducer, it gets the next state, it calls all of its subscribers, it sends that state to them, and then it holds on to that state until the next thing is dispatched. We'll look at the code later, and or we may or may not get time to that, but you can look at the code later, and it's not much more than 100 lines of code doing that mechanics and then offering a lot of checks. So there are some things you cannot do. For example, your states, let's see. So your states should be plain JS objects, and so should your actions. And there'll be a way to dispatch things. Redux provides us a way to dispatch things that are not just plain JavaScript objects. We will see in the future that you can introduce middleware, which changes how Redux works. Or more specifically, it sits in front of the dispatch function. And if you, for example, try and dispatch a promise, you can write middleware that waits until the promise resolves and then dispatches the thing it resolves with. We're not starting with that. For now, all our state and our actions are all just going to be plain JavaScript objects, which initially is going to it's going to feel a little bit awkward because it seems like we're doing too much work. Like we're going to be writing actions all over the place rather than making function calls to change the state directly. And then we're going to, in some cases, have to go through some gymnastics when expressing the relationship between things in our state, because you can't have like cross references between things in your state, right? Like nothing in your state can have a pointer to something else if it's all immutable. That said, if you go through these gymnastics, you get a lot of good wins. One good win is that you know from a given initial state, if you have the sequence of actions that was dispatched, you can get to the final state. This makes this model extremely good for any kind of like collaborative or shared editing situation. So you can imagine like developing a text editor in which anything anyone can do, like any user action, results in an action being dispatched. And you know the initial state because the initial state is like, say, always an empty document. And from there, if you just replay the action log on anyone's store, you'll get them to a document that looks the same. And that's pretty cool. That's like very powerful. And a lot of teams use a setup like this to do their collaborative crazy Firestone is what I was about to say, capstone projects. And they often use Firebase to do the actual sending of the journal from one machine to another. Okay, there's one more thing that we often see in Redux, and that is, it's a kind of optional part, but it's highly recommended, action creators. And these are just functions that return actions. So an action is just a plain JS object. This is where it kind of starts to sound crazy. Like, why on earth am I writing a function that returns an object that I can dispatch somewhere that causes a state change? And the reason is that it decouples each of these things. So we have, by architecting our app in this way, we have a sequence of actions that aren't necessarily connected to any particular implementation. And it gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to decouple the large-scale gestures and changes we want to have in our app from the nitty-gritty of like what's happening inside of this particular component. It also lets most of your components, or more of your components, become dumb. And that's always nice because dumb components are extremely easy to test. They're like very predictable. They don't have state or like any weirdness. And those are all good things for us. Okay, so we're gonna take this component, this app, this like very complicated app, and we're gonna make it use Redux. So to do that, what shall I do first? I guess the first thing I should do is remove this semicolon because it's irritating me. And the second thing I'm gonna do is import Redux. That's not right. I think I need to import create store. Oh, see, this is what I mean about a text editor that helps you. So create store is a function exported from Redux. You can imagine what it does. It creates a store. So we can do that. And what do we need to pass in? Okay, we need to pass in a whole bunch of stuff. A reducer is required. That's what the lack of a question mark after it means. The enhancer is optional, so I'm just going to ignore it. It looks like the enhancer is where you would put middleware, which we'll talk about in a future workshop. And then this function is going to return a store, is the last part of this little info box. What's on page 2? Nothing. Okay, so I need to give it a reducer. Right now, I am not completely sure what my reducer should do. So let me just write one, and I'll figure it out later. It'll be a function that takes state and action and returns. So right now, I'm just going to have my reducer do the dumbest thing, which is take a state and an action and return the same state. So my reducer never does anything. I think possibly if I run this, Redux is actually going to complain because my reducer returns an undefined state or a null state if it's given undefined or null. And Redux actually expects the reducer to have some kind of default here so that when it starts up, it can send a null state and a fake action into the reducer in order to get the first state. So it's kind of a clever way to initialize, to like get the first state of our store. Let's see what happens if I don't do this. Hey, nothing, it's still working, great. Well, we'll run into that problem when we run into that problem then. Okay, so the first step that I like to do when I'm like architecting a Redux app is to figure out what my actions are. And then my second step is to figure out how they affect the state, which implicitly means I have to figure out what is on the state. So for this component, what are my actions? Yeah, so pick a new joke. That's a good action. What's another one? Yeah, like C answer. Great. And in fact, I already have, you can sort of tell that these are actions because in my stateful component, they were things that resulted in set state getting called. So similarly, actions are going to result in our Redux state changing. It's just slightly more circuitous, or if you prefer, slightly more abstract and customizable. So one reason that we typically have action creators is because they let us document what our actions actually are. Like, what are all the actions that our store is going to take? So let's actually start by writing some action creators. And this is a convention that I don't completely love, but we're going with it for the moment. The convention in Redux land is that each action has a type field. So an action would look like this. And the type must always be a string. So it can be anything. By convention, it's in all caps. So next joke might be an action that we have. And I guess we don't need anything else, right? Like, what would we have to specify with this action other than, like, please give me another joke? So we'll leave that for now. If we had to specify something else, like go to joke, that might be a different action, joke ID. So in that case, we would want to write an action creator. So go to joke. So this is an example of an action with an action creator, or with a parameter. We're just going to have an action. By convention, action creators are functions. So we'll just have it be a function, takes nothing, and returns next joke. OK, and I think the other action we said was get answer, maybe? Answer joke? Answer joke. OK. So I think that starts to, OK, so this is enough to start to figure out what needs to be on our state. And I think we can use what is currently on our component state as a guide. So right now, the state has a joke, and answered has been false. I think we actually want to have a few more things on our state now that we're moving into Redux, because right now we have this kind of like messy, oh, random joke is just a free-floating function, and there are all these jokes in here, which we would normally get from the database, but they're actually just like hard-coded. It's fine. And I think it would actually be nice if these were all on the state. If like we had some sort of initial like load jokes thing that happened. What's that? Yeah, this, I mean, honestly, when I made this, I went and Googled skeleton jokes and found the first page, and I copied it and pasted it, and then I didn't even bother reformatting it, because why when you have JavaScript? Okay, so we have all of our jokes. Let's put those on our default state. So we'll say jokes are part of our state. Is that going to be a problem? I think that's not going to be a problem. The problem I'm wondering about is, like, I'm using jokes up here, but jokes is defined down here. But I actually think it'll be fine, because we won't get here until the reducer is called, which is a little while later, I hope. Well, we can see. Is it going to explode? Cannot read property length of undefined. Oh yeah, and now we have this whole thing where, like, the joke that is currently being displayed is based on this function. Okay, let's do this in two parts, actually. Let's just port what we have right now, and then we can talk about how we might refactor it better. All right, so our reducer right now starts with this as the initial state, and then it's going to receive an action, and it needs to return a new state. That looks more sane to me. Okay, so what are the various actions it's going to have to receive? I guess these two. So the typical pattern you see inside of Redux reducers is that you switch on action.type, which is reasonable to do because you know that all actions must have a type. And then at the very bottom, you return state, because if you didn't handle this type of action, you want to just say, like, okay, do nothing. So the two things we're going to handle are next joke and answer joke. So for next joke, what's the state we want to return? So next joke is what happens when I've already gotten an answer, and I want to just get a new joke. Yeah. So joke will be a random joke, and then answered will be false again. And then for answer joke, we want to do something a little different, right? We want to take our current state. We don't want to change the joke that's being displayed. We just want to set answer to true. So the typical way, there's a couple of ways you can do this. One way is to use object.assign. So assign to the empty object, answered false, and then whatever else was in, I think it's going to be here, right? State. Oh, answered true, right. Thank you. Another way you can express this is by saying, you can use the rest operator inside an object, I think. What is it complaining about? Unreachable code detected. Oh, it's so smart. Right, because I returned on the previous line. So I'm going to leave this in for posterity, or with the spread operator. In part, I'm not completely sure this syntax will work in the workshop today. This needs compiler support, and I don't think Juke's compiler is set up for it, although this workshop, or this, like, skeletons compiler is. Okay, so now we should have a store that can answer jokes and go to the next joke. One nice thing about Redux is that it's very testable, so let's do that. Let's put store on the window, and let's also put next joke and answer joke on the window. And then we can just play with them in the console. Can't read property length if undefined. Oh man, I am getting that problem. That is exactly the problem I was afraid I would get. Okay, that's okay. We can fix this by not being quite so stupid about how we do this. Let's move this jokes database to its own little file. Yeah, go here into app. Sure. Jokes.js. And then I can export this function and then export my jokes as well. I guess maybe this is default. Export. Can I do export default jokes? Is that the thing? Yeah. Okay.
Sorry,
Question?
kind of a joke.
They're really bad. They're really bad. Some of them are borderline inappropriate, probably. Sorry about that.
I haven't seen those.
Oh, okay. Well, I think they're mostly just terrible. Yeah.
Yeah, like really terrible.
Okay, so let's try this again. Let's import our jokes. And I guess I have to say import jokes and random joke from jokes. Okay, are you going to stop failing?
Do you not have the problem where jokes is going to mean that instead of what you want it to in Redux?
Oh, I guess one problem I might be having. Actually, wait, this should not be a problem. Jokes is not defined. Sure. Did you mean because this was up there rather than down here?
No, I don't. I just meant if you're importing it as jokes, don't you still run into the problem where jokes means you want it to mean two separate things?
Export default. Yeah, I guess what is the problem here? Export. Fine, there won't be any default export. I'm still learning import export, honestly. This is gonna drive me crazy though. Like, does anyone know what the right thing is? Export const, export default const jokes.
Yeah, but you probably can't export default.
Yeah, you can do it.
Can you just not export like objects as the default export? That doesn't make any sense. Export default jokes. But that's what I had before and it fails, right?
What happens when you just export the const and the structure on top?
Export default, like,
Or no, export const jokes.
I bet it's that. This is what it is. It is, it is. Oh, okay, this is what I have to do. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so the answer is you can either do this, export default, and then just the thing, just the object, I think. Oh, yeah, and it's failing here. But then it doesn't get a name in the local module, so for things like this, you have to say export or you have to declare it and then export it down here. Okay. Answered. Okay, so now we are apparently getting a store. Do we have a store? We have a store, great. Which means I can ask the store, okay, here are things you can do to a Redux store. It actually has a pretty good little representation in the console. I can say store.getState. So this should have a default random joke object. Hey, yeah. Oh, God. And then it has not yet been answered. Okay, so it's initializing this correctly. There is a subscribe function and a replace reducer function, which I believe if you call it will say it's not supported anymore. Expect yeah, console log would be a good one. Oh, it does work. Okay, don't do that. Probably hot swapping reducers is not something you need to do. But subscribing to a store, that is something you need to do. So subscribe, we can look at its signature in here, takes a callback to be invoked on every dispatch. So every time the state changes, actually, that's not true. Every time something is dispatched, regardless of whether the state changed, because maybe the reducer didn't do anything to it and it returned the same state, but nevertheless, Redux will call all of its listeners and tell them, hey, here is the new state, or here is a state, and it is the current state. And actually, I lied, because it doesn't even do that. Look at the signature of the listener. The listener takes nothing and returns nothing. So in fact, listeners, this is really irritating. Why don't I see anything? Oh, man. Okay, so in fact, listeners have to call getState in order to get the current state. All subscribe does is say, like, yo, you should check yourself, something just changed. Or really, you should check the store. So let's go, oh wow, this is gonna be confusing. Okay, so here we can do, so let's subscribe something. And let's subscribe a function that console logs store.getState. So that's just gonna be watching the store for us. Notice that it returned an unsubscribe function. When we use, oh goodness. When we use this from inside of React, we'll probably want to call unsubscribe when our component unmounts. And in general, like whenever you're done listening to the store, you want to call that unsubscribe function so the store's not broadcasting events and causing state changes when you didn't expect them. So now if I dispatch something, first of all, can I create an action? I think I can. What did I call it? Next joke. So if I just call next joke, I get this object, next joke. And if I call store.dispatch with next joke, I get, so you can notice two things. One, the second line is what store.dispatch returned. So you can see that it returned the action that was dispatched. That's maybe not that useful right now, but in the future when we're dispatching like things that may return promises, you can use that return value and actually dot then off the dispatch to say like, oh, after this has happened, do something else. But for now, the interesting part is what our subscriber printed, which is right here, and I'm now wishing that I'd annotated it, saying like, here's the next state. But in any case, when I dispatch next joke, I think we got a different joke, right? Let's try that again, just to be sure. I love everybody. And if we dispatch answered or answer joke, then answered is false, which I think is wrong, which means there's something wrong with my reducer. I bet the wrong thing is this, because the order of these things matters. Let's see if that helps. Oh, so now I get another chance. I'm going to say next state. So same problem. Oh, no, wait. Why? What's wrong? Why doesn't it like me? We tried everything, right? We tried it here, we tried it there. Let's try returning something else entirely. Like, this is fine. I mean, you probably don't want to do this ever. But your reducer can return anything. Your state can be anything, including the string of screaming into the void. What is happening on line 12? Oh, nothing. Okay, great. So we'll subscribe again. We'll dispatch answer joke. Okay, now the next state is as. Okay, so it's working, and my object.assign just isn't working very well. For the purposes of expediency, I guess let's first try this. Okay, so that's working. I guess I need to look up object.assign to understand precisely like how the order of things works. But this works, and I do know that if you decide to use this form, the triple dots, that should go at the front. For the same reason that if you use this operator, the spread operator for props, that should go at the front before other props. Otherwise, it will override the props that you probably want to override it. Does that make sense? When we did this kind of thing, some component, some prop 2. Do you remember how when some prop was in this dot state and we had it like this, everything was terrible because this was overriding some prop. So the order of these things matters, and the spread for objects almost always goes first. That's almost certainly what you want. Here, the JSX spread operator, the spread should probably go first. Okay. Okay, so now we can, now we sort of have a state machine and like we're reasonably convinced that it's doing what we want. So now let's hook up our component to it. So in our component, when we mount, let's subscribe us to the store. So how do we do that? Store.subscribe, and then a function that causes us to set our state with store.getState. So we're just going to take the whole state and set it as our state. Seems reasonable. And I guess, we don't need to dispatch next joke anymore because we know that the store is already initialized with some reasonable state. We don't need these handler functions anymore because they are going to, we might actually end up having like little helper functions, but the things that these were doing are now handled by our reducers and action creators. I'll comment them out because I think we might still end up using them, or using a small function to help us. And then when we render, we pluck everything off state. This part should not change. And then here, instead of just calling this.nextJoke or this.answer, we should be dispatching. And so I'm actually going to leave this code as is. This is why I sort of hesitated. And I'm going to change these functions to dispatch to our store. So this is going to say store.dispatch, what was it, next joke. And this is going to say store.dispatch, answer joke. And I think that should actually do it. Wow, that would be really impressive. Oh, so answer just because that's what I called it down here. It's just a helper function. Otherwise, I would have to write this arrow inside here, and it would just be kind of ugly. Okay, so unfortunately, nothing is working. Nothing is working at all. Oh, so I think we do actually, we either need to dispatch something into the store. I'm betting our subscribers never called because we subscribed, but then the store doesn't have any, like, we haven't dispatched anything. So let's do this and then also set, we'll basically do this once beforehand. So this is necessary because we don't have, because like nothing is being dispatched, right? We call, we say like, okay, whenever like something is dispatched, we'll change our state and then we never dispatch anything. So we have to like initialize our state from what's in the store and then we can start getting, then we'll display something and then we'll call these functions which dispatch something. And there's a whole reason why Redux's logo is these like 2 or 3 things chasing each other, because it's a cycle. Oh my god. Yay. Okay, questions on this? Up to and including, why are we doing this at all? Do I have the Redux DevTools installed? Oh, I don't. Okay, I'm going to install those for a second. I think the Redux DevTools are probably one of the best arguments for using Redux. Although I'm not completely sure how to use this thing. Let's see. Yeah, Redux DevTools extension, that's what I want. Ooh, that does look fun. No questions? Still percolating? Okay. Yeah, go for it.
Back when you were talking about the Eagles called Firebase,
Yeah.
like for the capstone people use
Mm-hmm.
Firebase. So I thought Git would be very similar to everything you were saying. The state is immutable, so on and so forth. Why use something like Firebase instead of just using Git?
So Firebase is real time. Like Firebase, you make a change and everyone sees it instantly. Also, Firebase, it sort of gives you much less. It basically gives you a giant synced JSON object in the cloud. So it is your server and it is your authentication. And that's all great, except then you're completely locked in. And so if like Google decides to start charging $1,000 a month or something, you basically either have to do it or have to bail. They're probably not going to, but that's the downside of having sort of a perfectly handed to you cloud solution. Okay, unfortunately now I have to reload Chrome. And I also think I have to do this crazy thing, which I'm just going to do it. Okay, so I'm copying this magic text in order to make the Redux DevTools work. You too can copy this magic text in order to make the Redux DevTools work. I guess the magic text looks for this crazy thing, Redux DevTools extension, and then calls it. Okay, that looks right. Restart Chrome. Okay. Really?
It's going to local Joe's.
Local gist, thank you. Great. I really hope I see Redux on here. That's very promising. Also, why does everything want to tell me, here's what's new in our app? I really don't care. I just never care. I definitely don't want the dev tools to start doing that. Okay, so this is like, for me, a huge selling point for Redux. Here are all the states your application has ever gone through. And if I click on one of these, I can go back in time to that state. So like, I was looking at this joke, and then I got the answer. And you can do other crazy stuff with this. You can edit a state out of history and like replay it, and there's cool stuff. And this is possible because Redux forces you to go through these like gymnastics of like, okay, I'm going to articulate every state change that my application could go through as one of these actions. And then I'm going to make my states serializable as JSON. It makes it very easy for some external thing to come in and be like, I know that if I'm holding on to a Redux state, I can store it as JSON, and I don't have to worry about like, oh, maybe someone has like references to it, or maybe it's going to change, or like any of these things that are possible with normal JavaScript objects, where like they can be weird and exotic, and they can have like methods and getters and stuff. Redux actions and states don't have that. And because of that, you can sort of work with them and manipulate the inner workings of your app in this like very cool and like fine-grained way. As our apps get bigger and bigger, Redux gets more and more useful, because having to write action creators means you have to like articulate, here are all the ways my app can change, which is a really useful entry point to a new code base. You're like, here are all the things anyone can do to this program. And similarly, all the reducers, which we'll talk about like how you end up being able to combine reducers. All of your reducers like articulate how each piece of the state responds to those actions. And so it kind of provides you with a mental model for how data flows through your app and how it responds to user actions. By no means is it the only mental model, but a consistent mental model is better than no consistent mental model. And this is a pretty good one with some like cool side effects. Okay, the last thing I want to show you is something called combine reducers. It is going to be a little bit, okay. Oh, this is not good. Oh, this is fine, yay. It's going to be a little bit contrived here because we have such a simple state, but we're going to go with it. So Redux gives us this function called combine reducers. And what it lets us do is break up our state so that different reducers control different parts of it. This is useful after, like, once we have a bigger state. Like, this state is probably small enough. It's definitely small enough that one reducer is fine. But if you had to put all of the possible actions for your entire app into one reducer function, that would be completely crazy. So what combine reducers lets us do is write two separate reducers and then combine them. And the way it does that, we'll start with the endpoint here. Instead of saying reducer here, I'm going to say combine reducers. And I give it what it's calling a reducer's map object, which is easier to show than to describe, I think, because it sort of looks like your state, but then the values are the reducer that is responsible for that. So in our case, the joke will be the joke reducer, and the answered will be answered reducer. And then these two reducers only have to worry about their part of the state. So like, what is the current joke, and what is the current state of being answered? Which means I can take my reducer here. I'm going to leave it around for posterity and write two new reducers. Let's see. So my joke reducer is going to take a state which starts as a random joke, and an action, which is anything, and it's going to return, okay, so either action will be next joke, in which case it returns a new random joke. So if action next joke, return random joke. Otherwise, we'll return state. And then we don't handle the answer joke action, but I don't think we have to, because the joke doesn't change when we answer it. So that's fine. And then answered is an even simpler reducer, I hope. Answer joke, or answer, what did I call it? Answered reducer. Yeah. And that's going to take a state which starts out as not answered, and an action, and if action.type is answer joke, then we will respond with true, otherwise we'll respond with the current state. So this actually kind of already is easier to think about, I think, than this one reducer which kind of entangles both parts of the state. And it should work in exactly the same way. You can look at the Redux source and see how combined reducers is written. It's something you can kind of like imagine writing yourself. It basically it's this higher ordered function that maps over this object and then collects all of the reducers that you've specified and calls each of them. It calls all of the reducers for every action. Okay, let's see if I broke everything. I did not break everything. I did break everything. Okay, next joke. Oh, action.type. Okay. What did I do? No, that's okay. It's okay to have trailing commas in object literals. Okay, but nice thing about Redux, I can look at these states and be like, why, like, what's going on? So when I initialize, here, state. Okay, when I initialized, my reducer picked out a random joke for me, and then answered was false. That's what I would expect. When I answered the joke, answered became true, also good. And then when I clicked on this, I got to next joke, which, right. Answered actually does have to respond to next joke by setting itself to false. So here I'm going to revive my switch statement. And I'm going to say when it's answer joke, I want to return true. And when it's, what is it, next joke, return false, because we want to reset the state of this, and otherwise return the state. And then the last thing you'll see very often in Redux that is, again, just convention, but it's like kind of useful. You see how I'm using these string tags everywhere and they kind of proliferate? Many people like to define them as constants. I have mixed feelings about this. I sort of understand the documentational purposes, but I also feel like line 12 is one of the stupidest lines of code I've ever written. It just seems so pointless. But it's not totally pointless because like then your editor will start auto-completing these things, and it's like it gives you a little bit more support and makes typos a little bit easier to catch. And I guess if I was really smart, I would have done this with Command D.
Is there a reason that you have to do all caps and
No. It can be, you could have it be anything. I think one reason actually is that people like having these defined as constants, and conventionally constants are frequently all capped. And if I could like I could name this anything I want. It could be like joke should be answered or something if I want to do that. But it's just like not how not that Dan, the Dan who wrote Redux, decided to do it, and like everyone kind of followed his guidance. There's nothing magic about most of these Redux conventions. I went too far. Okay, and then I can change these too. Oh, shit. Okay. Okay, did I break everything with that little refactor? No. Okay, great. So that's Redux. That is basically all of Redux. If we went and looked at the source code, it would not have too much more than what I've described. It would have a lot of like error checking, like if you try and dispatch from inside a reducer, what happens? Nothing. Or it throws an exception, which we can try doing, like store.dispatch next joke. It's going to happen here. Cannot read property dispatch if undefined. Oh, because the store isn't defined yet. Anyway, trust me that you shouldn't dispatch inside your reducer. I'm not too concerned about you doing that because Redux disables dispatch while the reducer is running and throws an exception if you try. Okay, so to review, Redux gives us this model of a state container, a reducer that describes how actions change the state being contained, and then action creators which help us create actions that are going to change our states. By describing the app in this way, we get like various cool introspection features because suddenly every part of our app, or like the core pieces of our app's state, are easily available for inspection by various tools and can be passed around and handled with like not delicately, like they're just normal JavaScript objects. And then there is actually a standard way to bind a Redux store to a React component, but we are initially going to have you do the binding manually by subscribing to the store. Oh, I forgot something. This is kind of important. So what's going to happen right now, if I ever unmount, which when would I unmount? I'm not really sure. Yeah, this actually probably causes me to unmount. So if I'm unmounted, but then somehow something is dispatched to the store, which is totally plausible, right? Because the store is going to be global. It's not going to be for each component. There's going to be a store.jsx file, or .js file. It's going to export the store, and everything is going to consume it. Well, that was anticlimactic. I was really expecting an error. But typically, if you try and set state on a component that is no longer mounted, React complains. And that's going to happen if our store sends out like a subscriber notification and we've become unmounted. So what we typically want to do is say, we want to store the unsubscribe function, and then on component will unmount, what? We want to call this.unsubscribe. Oops. Okay. So it's kind of like invisibly better behavior, but it is better.
Why is the unsubscribe the same as what looks like the subscribe method?
So store.subscribe returns a function that when called deletes the subscription. So
you only do subscribe once, therefore that makes sense as a return value. Okay.
yeah, exactly. It's a pretty common pattern too. Like observables use it. You'll see it over and over. All right. Any last questions before we kick off the workshop? Okay, great. I will send out the link to this video. Good luck with today's workshop. I hope you enjoy Redux. I hated it at first and then came to like it. I feel very old when I say things like that.